Imagine losing your house because you owed $8,000 in property taxes. Okay, that part makes sense, right? You don't pay your taxes, there are consequences. But what if I told you the county sold your house for $500,000 and kept every single penny? Not just the $8,000 you owed, not just the fees and interest, all of it. $500,000 gone. That was legal in California until this year. Your neighbor's grandma, your cousin who fell behind during COVID, that single mom 3 blocks over who missed one payment after her husband died, they didn't just lose their homes, they lost their entire life savings because of a loophole so brutal that advocacy groups called it legalized theft. And here's the thing that's going to make you angry. This wasn't some rare edge case. This was happening constantly. Millions of dollars every single year just vanished from people who were already struggling. I'm going to walk you through exactly how this worked, why it took so long to fix, and what AB 418 actually changes in 2026. But first, you need to understand something about property taxes in California that most people have completely wrong. When you own a home, you're not just making mortgage payments. You're also paying the county every year for the privilege of owning that property. It's how schools get funded, how roads get fixed, all of that. And if you stop paying, the county doesn't just send you a strongly worded letter and hope for the best. They have the power to take your house. That part isn't new. That part has always been true. But here's where it gets weird. In most states, when the government forecloses on your house for unpaid taxes, they auction it off, take what you owe them, and give you back the rest. Makes sense, right? You owed $10,000, they sold it for $300,000, you get $290,000 back. That's how it works in places like Montana, Arizona, New York. The government collects its debt, you lose the house, but keep your equity. Fair is probably the wrong word, but it's at least logical. California didn't do that. California allowed counties to keep everything. And I mean everything. If you owed $5,000 and your house sold for $400,000, the county pocketed all $400,000. Zero compensation, zero equity returned, you got nothing. The legal term for this is home equity theft, and it's exactly what it sounds like. You lost more than your house. You lost your retirement fund, your kid's inheritance, any chance of starting over somewhere else, because the county could legally strip every dollar of equity you'd built over decades and keep it as profit. And this wasn't theoretical. This was happening to real people in real communities across California every single year. There's a woman in Los Angeles County who inherited her mother's house. Small place, nothing fancy, but it was paid off, worth about $350,000. She fell behind on property taxes during the pandemic, lost her job, couldn't keep up, owed around $12,000 by the time the county started foreclosure proceedings. She tried to work out a payment plan, tried to get an extension. Nothing worked. The county foreclosed, sold the house at auction for $340,000, and kept all of it. $12,000 owed, $340,000 taken, she got zero. Or take the elderly couple in Sacramento, both in their 70s, living on Social Security. They missed a few tax payments because they literally couldn't afford them anymore. The county foreclosed on a house worth $420,000, over $18,000 in back taxes. Sold it, kept the entire sale price, gave them nothing. They ended up in a rental apartment with no savings, no backup plan, no way to recover what they'd spent 30 years building. These aren't outliers. These aren't extreme cases that slipped through the cracks. This was how the system worked by design. Between 2014 and 2021, a study from the Pacific Legal Foundation tracked this across just a handful of states. They found that homeowners lost at least $860 million in equity theft. And California was one of the worst offenders. Millions of dollars every single year taken from people who were already struggling. Think about what that actually means for a second. You're a senior citizen living on a fixed income, you get sick, medical bills pile up, you miss a property tax payment, then another, you fall behind by a few $1,000s. The county starts the foreclosure process. You panic, you try to sell the house yourself, but foreclosure moves faster than you thought. Before you can find a buyer, the county takes it, sells it at auction, keeps the profit, and now you're homeless with nothing. That's not a cautionary tale. That's what happened over and over in California. So, why did this take so long to fix? That's the part that's going to frustrate you even more, because this wasn't some hidden loophole buried in obscure legal code. Advocacy groups had been screaming about this for years. The Pacific Legal Foundation, nonprofit legal organizations, families who'd been destroyed by this policy, they all knew. Everyone knew this was happening. But changing it required political will, and for a long time, counties fought back hard. Here's why. When a county forecloses on a property and keeps all the equity, that's free money for the local government. It's not budgeted, it's not expected, but it's a windfall. And once you get used to that kind of revenue stream, giving it up feels like a loss, even though it was never yours in the first place. Counties argued they needed this power to enforce tax collection. They said homeowners had plenty of opportunities to pay before foreclosure. They framed it as personal responsibility. You didn't pay your taxes, you face consequences. And on the surface, that argument sounds reasonable, but it ignores the reality of who this was actually hurting. This wasn't targeting millionaires with second homes. This wasn't catching real estate investors gaming the system. The people losing everything were elderly, disabled, low-income families, people who'd been hit with sudden medical crises or job losses, people who fell behind not because they were careless, but because life got hard and they couldn't keep up. And the punishment was total financial annihilation. Which brings us to AB 418. In 2024, California finally passed legislation to close this loophole. Governor Newsom signed it into law, and starting in 2026, home equity theft is over. Here's what changes. If the county forecloses on your house for unpaid property taxes, they still auction it off. That part doesn't change. You still lose the house if you can't pay, but now, after the auction, after the county takes what you owe in taxes and covers the costs of the sale, any money left over goes back to you. You owed $10,000, the house sold for $400,000, the county takes $10,000 plus sale fees, maybe another $5,000 or $10,000. You get the rest, $385,000. That's your equity. That's your money. And now by law, they have to give it back. This is what advocates have been calling a historic victory for property rights, and they're not wrong. This fixes an injustice that should have been illegal from the start. But let me be clear about something. This doesn't erase the pain of foreclosure. You still lose your house, you still get displaced, you still have to figure out where to live, how to rebuild, how to explain to your kids why you're moving. AB 418 doesn't prevent foreclosure. It just means that you won't lose everything when it happens. And that matters. That's the difference between losing your home and losing your entire future. Before AB 418, if you got foreclosed on, you walked away with nothing. No equity, no cushion, no way to rent an apartment or put a deposit on a new place. You were starting from zero, except worse than zero because now you also don't have a house. After AB 418, you still lose the house, but you walk away with whatever equity was left. Maybe that's $50,000. Maybe it's $300,000, but it's something. It's enough to move, enough to rent, enough to survive while you figure out what's next. That's not a small thing. And here's where it gets even more interesting. AB 418 might have retroactive implications. If your property was foreclosed and sold after 2022, but before this law officially took effect, you might be owed money. The language around this is still being worked out, but legal experts are saying there's a real chance that people who got wiped out in the last couple of years could file claims to recover their equity. I don't know how that's going to shake out yet. Nobody does. But if you or someone you know lost a house in California in the last 2 or 3 years, it's worth digging into, because the difference between $0 and $200,000 is life-changing. Now let's talk about what homeowners need to know going forward. First, AB 418 doesn't protect you from foreclosure itself. If you stop paying property taxes, the county will still take your house. That risk is real. The new law just ensures that when they take it, you get back what's yours. Second, the foreclosure process is changing slightly. Counties are now required to hold public auctions for all tax defaulted properties. No more quiet transfers, no more closed-door deals where the county just moves the title into their name and pretends like nobody's watching. Everything has to be public, everything has to be transparent, and any surplus funds after the debt is paid must be returned to the original owner.
Third, this sets a precedent. California is now the 20th state to end home equity theft. That means this is becoming the norm across the country. Other states are watching. Other states are introducing similar bills. The momentum is real and it's spreading. But here's the thing nobody's really talking about yet. AB 418 is a huge win for property rights. It's a massive correction of a broken system. But it's also revealing something deeper about how we treat people in financial distress. Because here's the truth. If you can foreclose on someone's house over $8,000 in unpaid taxes and sell it for $500,000, the system was never about collecting the debt. It was about punishing people for being poor. Think about it. If the goal was to recover the money owed, you'd take the $8,000 plus interest and fees, maybe $15,000 total. Then you'd return the rest. That's debt collection. That's fair enforcement. But when you take everything, when you strip someone of $485,000 because they couldn't come up with $8,000, that's not enforcement anymore. That's something else. And the fact that this was legal, that counties defended this practice, that it took years of advocacy and lawsuits to stop it, tells you everything you need to know about who the system was designed to protect. Here's what I keep thinking about. How many families lost everything because they fell behind by a few $1,000s? How many seniors ended up homeless because they couldn't afford their property taxes and the county decided their equity was fair game? How many people saw their parents' houses, their inheritance, their safety net, just disappear because California allowed local governments to profit from poverty? And how much of that money, those millions and millions of dollars in stolen equity, went into county budgets, paid for projects, funded programs, built things that benefited everyone except the people who actually owned the houses? AB 418 doesn't answer those questions. It doesn't undo what happened. It doesn't give back what was taken from families before 2026. But it does close the door. It says this ends now. And that's something. So what happens next? Starting in 2026, if you're facing foreclosure for unpaid property taxes, you're still in a bad situation. You're still going to lose your house if you can't catch up, but you're not going to lose everything. The county will auction your property, take what you owe, and give you back the rest. And if you're someone who lost a house in the last couple of years, pay attention to how the retroactive compensation angle shakes out. Because if you're owed money, you need to file for it. Nobody's just going to mail you a check. You have to know your rights and act on them. For everyone else, here's what this means is that now California just joined a growing number of states that are saying the government can collect what it's owed in taxes, but nothing more. That's a baseline standard of fairness that should have existed from the beginning. And now it does. But here's the uncomfortable part. This victory only happened because people fought for it. Families who got destroyed by the system didn't just disappear quietly. They sued, they organized, they told their stories until enough people paid attention and legislators had to act. So the question I keep coming back to is this: how many other systems like this still exist? How many other loopholes are still open where the government or corporations or whoever can legally take more than they're owed because the law hasn't caught up yet? AB 418 fixed home equity theft in California. That's a win, but it took decades of people losing everything before anyone did anything about it. What else are we letting slide right now because it hasn't gotten bad enough yet? What other injustices are we tolerating because they're technically legal, even if they're clearly wrong? I don't have the answer to that, but I think it's worth asking. Now, let me walk you through some of the mechanics of how this actually worked, because understanding the details makes it even more infuriating. When you own property in California, your annual property tax is based on the assessed value of your home. For most people, that's somewhere between 1 and 2% of what your house is worth. So if you own a $300,000 house, you're probably paying $3,000 to $6,000 a year in property taxes. That money gets split up and distributed to different local agencies. Your school district gets a chunk, the county gets a chunk, special districts for things like water or fire protection get their pieces. It's not a small amount of money, but it's also not outrageous compared to what homeowners pay in other states. The problem starts when you can't pay. Maybe you lose your job. Maybe you get hit with medical bills. Maybe you're elderly and living on a fixed income that doesn't stretch far enough. Whatever the reason, you fall behind. You miss one payment, then another. The penalties and interest start piling up. And before you know it, what started as a $3,000 annual bill has ballooned into $10,000 or $15,000 because of all the fees. At this point, the county starts sending notices. They tell you you're delinquent. They warn you that if you don't catch up, they'll start foreclosure proceedings. And this is where most people panic and try to figure out a solution. Some people try to negotiate payment plans. Some try to borrow money from family. Some try to sell the house before the county can take it. But here's the thing. The foreclosure process moves fast, faster than most people realize. And once it starts, it's hard to stop. The county files paperwork. They notify you that your property is going into tax default. They set a date for the auction, and unless you can come up with the full amount you owe, plus all the accumulated fees and interest, they're going to take your house. Now, here's where the old system gets really ugly. In other states, when the county auctions off your house, they're trying to get fair market value. They want to sell it for as much as possible because they know they have to give you back the surplus. So they advertise the sale. They make sure buyers know the property is available. They try to maximize the price. But in California, under the old rules, counties had no incentive to do that. They didn't have to return the surplus, so why bother trying to get top dollar? Some counties would hold auctions with minimal advertising. Some would set low starting bids. Some would sell properties to insiders or developers who knew how to game the system. And because the homeowner got nothing regardless of what the house sold for, there was no accountability. The county could sell a $400,000 house for $200,000, pocket the whole amount, and nobody could do anything about it. That's the part that made advocacy groups so angry. It wasn't just that homeowners were losing their equity, it was that the system was set up to minimize how much money the county had to spend on the foreclosure process while maximizing how much profit they could extract. Some counties would literally just transfer the property into their own name without even holding an auction. They'd assess the value, decide what it was worth, credit themselves for that amount, and take ownership. No public sale, no transparency, just a quiet transfer of wealth from a struggling homeowner to the local government. And all of this was legal. There were lawyers who built entire practices around fighting these foreclosures. They'd represent homeowners who were trying to save their properties or at least recover some equity. But the law was so heavily weighted in favor of the counties that most of these cases went nowhere. The homeowners would argue that the foreclosure was unjust, that the amount owed was tiny compared to the value of the property, that they should at least get back their equity. And the courts would basically shrug and say, sorry, that's what the law allows. It wasn't until advocacy groups started framing this as a constitutional issue that things started to shift. The Pacific Legal Foundation was one of the main organizations pushing this. They started filing lawsuits arguing that home equity theft violated the takings clause of the Fifth Amendment. The idea being that the government can't just take your property without just compensation. And if they're taking a $400,000 house to satisfy a $10,000 debt, that's not just compensation. That's confiscation.
These cases started working their way through the courts. Some won, some lost, but they generated enough attention that legislators started paying attention. And more importantly, they started feeling pressure from constituents who were hearing these stories and getting angry. Because once you understand what was happening, it's hard to justify. You can argue about the importance of enforcing tax collection. You can talk about personal responsibility and the consequences of not paying what you owe, but there's no reasonable argument for why the government should be able to pocket hundreds of thousands of dollars in equity as a penalty for owing a few thousand in taxes. That's not enforcement. That's theft with a legal stamp on it. So by the time AB 418 was introduced, there was already momentum behind it. Advocacy groups had done the groundwork. Media outlets had covered the stories. Families had testified about what they'd lost. And legislators from both parties were starting to see this as a problem that needed fixing. But even then, it wasn't easy. Counties pushed back. They argued that if they had to return surplus funds, it would complicate the foreclosure process. They'd have to spend more time and money on auctions. They'd have to track down former homeowners to return money. They'd lose a revenue stream they'd been relying on. And some legislators bought those arguments. They worried about the administrative burden on counties. They worried about unintended consequences. They wanted to make sure the bill was drafted carefully so it didn't create new problems while solving the old one. That's why it took until 2024 to get AB 418 passed. Not because anyone genuinely believed home equity theft was okay, but because changing the system meant overcoming institutional inertia and resistance from the entities that benefited from the status quo. But eventually, the political pressure became too much to ignore. The stories were too sympathetic, the injustice was too obvious, and Governor Newsom signed the bill into law. Now let's talk about what this looks like in practice, starting in 2026. If you fall behind on your property taxes and the county starts foreclosure proceedings, here's what happens under the new system. The county still sends you notices, they still warn you that you need to pay or they'll take your house. That part hasn't changed. You still have the same opportunities to catch up or work out a payment plan. But if you can't come up with the money and the foreclosure moves forward, the county now has to hold a public auction. They have to advertise the property. They have to make a good faith effort to get fair market value. Because now they know that anything above what you owe goes back to you, so there's less incentive to lowball the sale. Let's say your house is worth $400,000 and you owe $12,000 in back taxes plus another $3,000 in fees and interest. The county auctions it off and it sells for $380,000. That's less than market value, but it's still a substantial amount. The county takes the $15,000 you owe. They take maybe another $5,000 to cover the costs of the auction and the administrative work. That's $20,000 total. The remaining $360,000 goes back to you. You've lost your house. That's the consequence of not paying your taxes. But you haven't lost everything. You've got $360,000. That's enough to rent a place while you figure out your next move. That's enough to eventually buy another house, maybe something smaller or in a different area. That's enough to rebuild. Compare that to the old system where you'd walk away with nothing, where losing your house meant losing your entire financial foundation. The difference is night and day. And this is where AB 418 becomes more than just a technical fix to a legal loophole. It's a recognition that the punishment has to fit the crime. You didn't pay $12,000, so we're going to take $400,000 from you. That's not proportional. That's punitive in a way that goes far beyond what's needed to make the government whole. AB 418 restores proportionality. You didn't pay $12,000, so we're going to take $12,000 plus the costs of collecting it. Anything beyond that belongs to you. That's fair. That's how it should have worked from the beginning. But here's what I'm curious about. Why did it take this long? California isn't some backward state that's slow to adopt progressive policies. This is one of the most liberal states in the country. They're usually ahead of the curve on consumer protections, on preventing exploitation, on standing up for people who can't stand up for themselves. And yet this practice, this blatantly unjust system, was allowed to continue for decades. How did that happen? Part of it is visibility. Most people don't know anyone who's been through tax foreclosure. It's not something that comes up in casual conversation, so unless you're directly affected or you work in real estate or legal advocacy, you probably had no idea this was happening. Part of it is complexity. Property tax law is boring. It's technical. It's the kind of thing that doesn't make headlines unless someone works really hard to frame it in a way that people can understand and care about. And part of it is power dynamics. The people being hurt by this were already marginalized. They were elderly, poor, disabled, struggling. They didn't have lobbyists. They didn't have campaign donations to throw around. They didn't have political influence. The counties, on the other hand, had all of that. They had lawyers. They had relationships with legislators. They had arguments about why they needed this power to enforce tax collection. And for a long time, that was enough to keep the system in place.
It took sustained advocacy from organizations like the Pacific Legal Foundation to shift the balance. It took families willing to share their painful stories publicly. It took media coverage that made the issue impossible to ignore. And even then, it took years to get a bill passed. That's the frustrating reality of how change happens. Even when something is obviously wrong, fixing it requires a coordinated effort from people who are willing to fight for it. And sometimes a lot of people have to suffer before enough momentum builds to actually make a difference. So here's where we are now. AB 418 is the law. Starting in 2026, home equity theft is over in California. Homeowners who lose their houses to tax foreclosure will get back their equity minus what they owed. That's a huge win. That's genuinely life-changing for people who would have been wiped out under the old system. But there's still questions that need answering. What about people who lost their houses before AB 418 took effect? Is there any path to compensation for them? Some legal experts think there might be, especially for foreclosures that happened in the last couple of years. But nothing's been decided yet. There's no clear process, no official guidance. If you're someone who lost a house to tax foreclosure in California between 2022 and 2025, you need to be paying attention. Talk to a lawyer. Look into whether you have grounds to file a claim. Because if there's even a chance you could recover some of that lost equity, it's worth pursuing. And what about other states? California is the 20th state to ban home equity theft, which means there are still 30 states where this is legal. 30 states where counties can foreclose on your house for unpaid taxes and keep everything. That's a lot of people still at risk. The good news is that the momentum is building. As more states close this loophole, it becomes harder for the remaining states to justify keeping it. Advocacy groups are using California's law as a template. They're pushing similar bills in other legislatures. And the more success stories they can point to, the easier it becomes to convince lawmakers that this is the right thing to do. But change is slow. And in the meantime, people are still losing their homes and their equity in states that haven't caught up yet. There's also a bigger conversation we're not having about property taxes in general. Because here's the thing. The reason people fall into tax foreclosure in the first place is because property taxes can be a huge burden, especially for people on fixed incomes. If you bought your house 30 years ago and you've been paying the mortgage this whole time, you probably thought that once it was paid off, your housing costs would drop dramatically. And they do, except for property taxes. Your property tax bill doesn't go away when you pay off your mortgage. It doesn't get smaller when you retire and your income drops. It stays the same, or more likely, it goes up as your home's value increases. So you've got seniors who own their homes outright, but they can't afford the annual tax bill. They're house rich and cash poor. And the current system doesn't have great solutions for that. Some states have programs to help low-income seniors defer their property taxes. The idea being that you can delay payment until you sell the house or pass away, at which point the accumulated taxes get paid from the proceeds of the sale or from your estate. That helps people stay in their homes without facing foreclosure. But not every state has those programs. And even in states that do, not everyone qualifies or knows they exist. California has some limited programs, but they're not enough to protect everyone who's at risk. So even with AB 418 in place, there are still going to be people who lose their homes because they can't afford their property taxes. The difference is, now they'll at least get their equity back. But wouldn't it be better to prevent the foreclosure in the first place? That's a harder problem to solve because it requires rethinking how we fund local governments. Property taxes are a huge source of revenue for schools, counties, cities, special districts. If you start exempting people or allowing deferrals, that money has to come from somewhere. And that's where the political conversation gets complicated because everyone agrees that seniors shouldn't lose their homes over unpaid taxes, but nobody wants to talk about raising other taxes to make up the difference. So we end up with a system that's slightly less cruel than it used to be, but still fundamentally flawed. AB 418 is progress. It's meaningful progress, but it's not the end of the conversation. It's a step toward a fairer system, but there's still a long way to go. Here's what I think we should be demanding from lawmakers moving forward. 1, every state needs to ban home equity theft. There's no excuse for letting this practice continue anywhere. If California can do it, if 19 other states can do it, then every state can do it. 2, we need better programs to help people avoid tax foreclosure in the first place. Deferrals for seniors and disabled homeowners, payment plans that are actually accessible, automatic enrollment in assistance programs for people who qualify. Make it easy for people to stay current on their taxes instead of punishing them when they fall behind. 3, we need transparency in the foreclosure process. Public auctions should be genuinely public. People should be able to see what properties are being sold, what they're selling for, and where the money is going. No more quiet transfers. No more closed-door deals. And 4, we need accountability. If a county forecloses on a property and there's any indication they didn't follow the law, there should be consequences. Fines, lawsuits, whatever it takes to make sure the rules are being followed. None of this is impossible. None of this is radical. It's just basic fairness applied to a system that's been broken for way too long. So if you're watching this and you're thinking, okay, this is good, AB 418 fixed the problem, we're done here, I want to push back on that. We're not done. We're closer, but we're not done. There are still people losing their homes in states that haven't passed similar laws. There are still people in California who are at risk of foreclosure, even with AB 418 in place. And there are still questions about whether anyone who was harmed under the old system will ever get any kind of compensation. This is a win, but it's one win in a much longer fight. And I think that's the framing we need to hold on to. Celebrate the progress. The advocates who fought for this, the families who shared their stories, the legislators who pushed the bill through, they all deserve credit. This wouldn't have happened without them. But don't let this be the end of the conversation, because there's still work to do. If you lost a property in California since 2022, look into whether you're owed surplus funds. If you're behind on property taxes right now, understand that foreclosure is still a risk, but AB 418 means you won't lose everything. And if you know someone who's struggling with property taxes, make sure they know their rights under the new law. This isn't going to fix everything, but it's a start. And honestly, the fact that it took this long to fix something this obviously broken tells you how much more work there is to do. Am I wrong here? Is there something I'm missing about why counties fought so hard to keep this system in place? Drop a comment and let me know what you think.